Okay, so now our hedgehog is really starting to take shape, and the next thing we need to do is add his mouth. So I'm going to make two more small triangles in the same way that we made his nose earlier on. So I'm just folding my fox sheep wool into a triangular shape, and this wants to be roughly about 2.5 centimeters in its size, so the sides and the bottom of it. And I'm just going to place the flat end against the nose, so the larger flat end against our nose of our hedgehog here. So the point's kind of pointing downwards on an angle. So I'm going to hold it into place, and I'm just going to take my medium needle and I'm just going to felt that downwards, obviously being careful not to catch my fingers. So tack in all the sides until it's all nicely in place. So you can always, again, add a little bit more wool in if you need to. It's always better to start off with slightly less and then add to it rather than going in with too much straight away. So I'm focusing my stabbing around the sides of the piece that we've just added. You don't want to stab it so much that you end up with causing any indentation. You want it to be a smooth transition from the piece you've added to the rest of the hedgehog that we've already made. So I'm going to take another small piece, and it's measuring this piece just for reference. Just grabbing my tape measure for you. So it's measuring about 6 inches in length, and then it's about an inch in its width. So same principle, fold it down. It's quite a thin piece of wool. I haven't taken anything too thick because obviously as you're folding the wool, you're going to make it thicker anyway. But you probably want it to be about 0.5 centimetre in its thickness. So I'm just going to pull away that last piece there, and I'm just going to place that in the same position as we did with our previous piece, using my medium twisted star, and just felt it down into place. So it looks a bit odd at the moment because you've got this kind of gap in between, but don't worry about that because we'll hide it with some more wool in a moment. So felting around the sides, don't felt too much in the middle of the piece you've just added because we want to keep that bulk there, because that's going to help us to make our mouth look realistic. And if you've watched the tutorial on how to make animal mouths, you should be completely au fait with this now. You should be happy with how we do this. So now that's in place, what we're going to do is take some more fox sheep wool, and we're just going to tear off a small section, and we're going to place it over the top of what we've just felted. So I'm going to take my double fine twisted needles here, and I'm just going to use those to felt that piece of wool over the top of the two triangular pieces under the nose. So if you've got anything going over the nose, just swoop it down with your needle backwards and then just felt it down so it's felted underneath the nose nice and tightly between the nose and those two extra pieces, and you shouldn't see any joins then. And you just want to keep going until all the sides are nicely felted down and nice and smooth. So you don't need to be, the nice thing is because the fox sheep's very thick, it kind of hides any kind of joins and things that you may have. It's a very forgiving wool. I think I've said that before, so I apologise if I've repeated myself, but it is a very forgiving wool. And a lot of people might just use it as only a core wool, but I think it just works really nicely in certain projects depending on what you're making. But if you're making something like a hedgehog or a mouse and you want it to have that kind of slightly more rougher kind of appearance to it, then it's a great wool to use. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using my needle and I'm using them one over the top just to felt down into the middle of between the two pieces we've added. And then I'm just felting round. There we go, just felting in that middle piece, getting that nice and tightly pushed in, and then just felting round all the crevices, getting everything anchored into position. So I'm just going to have a check. I'm just going to take my single needle and I'm just going to use my single needle just to get a bit more definition in that line between the two triangles. Just kind of using my needle to felt down any loose ends from the fox sheep that we've put on a moment ago and felt it into the crevices of the sides of the nose to hide any loose ends. And what I'm doing, I'm just feeling it and feeling if it feels smooth as well, because in certain lights it might be difficult to see where your sort of the pieces have been added. You might see lines and things, but if it's a darker lit room that you're felting in, you might not see those immediately. So it's good to use your fingers and just feel and make sure everything feels smooth and integrated, rather than having any kind of bulk at the edges where the piece has been added. You want to get those sides, those peripherals of the triangles that you've added nice and smooth and flowing into the rest of the hedgehog's face. I think, yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So I'm just felting around the mouth now, just underneath, getting a bit more definition. We're going to be adding some more brown roving wool in a moment to create our mouth, so you'll get even more definition once we've added that into place. And then just continuing to shape our hedgehog's face with my needles, just getting that definition around the eyes. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is take our brown merino roving wool that I spoke about a moment ago. We're taking a small slither, and what we're going to be doing, so that's 3 inches in length, we're going to be taking that piece and we're going to be placing it in between the gap we've just made. So what I'm doing is I'm taking that piece and I'm just rubbing it between my fingers and getting the fibres to merge together. Placing the top end, so I've got about 1 centimetre of length left just hanging over the nose, and I'm just going to felt that down into place very carefully. And then once you've anchored it and you've kind of got a rough idea of where you want it, what you want to do is just separate and split that piece of wool in half, like that. And there we go, then we're creating that smile that we're looking for. So I'm just going to give that another felt in to the in-between part, and then we're going to just use our needle and we're just going to guide our needle around the mouth area. And I'm going to go for a smiling mouth with this little chap. So just move your needle very carefully in small, shallow stabbing motions around the mouth of your hedgehog. And you want to get this nice and deeply felted in so it looks realistic. Like I've said before, we don't want to create that 2D look where everything's kind of just laying on top of our piece and it's not kind of felted in properly. So it kind of just sits on top like if you've got a biro and you've drawn it on. We want it to be nice and deeply set. So I'm just going to take my embroidery scissors here and I'm going to just trim off the excess. What you'll find also when you're creating a mouth is you don't want to go too wide with it. If you go wide with it, it just looks a bit too odd, unless you're kind of looking to go for that kind of look, but it doesn't look overly authentic, is how I'd say. I've done it previously and it just looks a bit strange, so I think it's nice to kind of keep a mouth sort of about 2 centimetres in length for each kind of bow that you're making, each arc you're making. That's obviously depending on the size of the piece that you're creating as well. So the larger the piece, obviously the bigger the mouth's going to be. But you want it to probably be like 1/4 of the size of the rest of the face is probably about right. If you're doing a smile, that is. So I'm just going in with my medium needle and I'm just felting all of that down. and getting it nicely tucked in. And you can see the more I'm felting it, you can still see the brown, but it's just looking a lot more natural. And I'm just checking it, making sure it all looks nice and even. And then I'm just going into the corners of the mouth. Just going to turn him upside down. And I'm just going to create those little dimples at the top of the mouth where he's smiling. And it just gives that other level to our sculpture, that other level of realism, and makes it just look a lot more professional. So I'm just going to go in a bit more here. You can go too overboard with this technique, so always be careful to not do too much. Just do a little bit and check it, and then if you feel that it needs a bit more, go in and do a little bit more, but don't go in too heavy-handed straight away. Otherwise, speaking from experience, your animal could come out looking a bit like the Joker, which you don't want, unless you're a massive Batman fan, of course, in which case go for it. So I'm just going to go for the other side. And I'm just continuing to manipulate the wool with my fingers, pushing it into place and then felting it into place. Securing it down. And I'm just working on the mouth still, getting it nice and natural looking, making sure there's no sharp angles that have suddenly appeared. Just pushing that nose up again and giving that a bit more of a felt as well. And giving it a squeeze inwards. And I just like to check the profile all the time as well and make sure that not only does your piece look great from the front, looking at it front end on, but it also looks great when it's being looked at on its profile. I think that's really important, and it just adds to sort of the professionalism of your piece, but it just makes it more aesthetically pleasing to look at as well. I think I have OCD when it comes to making faces. And if it's not quite right, it really bugs me, and I have to make it look as good as I can. So I think that's one of my big bugbears, is when you create a piece and the profile looks a bit naff, even though looking at it front on end on, it looks really good. So just going to felt around the chin, get a bit more shaping around this area. I guess at the moment he looks a bit like a potato. A cute potato with a face. So I'm happy with that now. So what we're going to do next is we're going to be adding our spines in. And for this we're going to be using some brown Corriedale wool. It doesn't have to be Corriedale, but it will need to be some form of bats. And you want it to be a significantly darker brown to the fox sheep wool that you're using, or if you're using a different wool to fox sheep, something that's darker, so you've got that nice contrast there with the spines. So I'm just going to hold it on the top of his head, and I'm going to felt down into the middle and then backwards. So I'm felting it down against the back of our hedgehog, so he looks a bit like Elvis at the moment with a bit of a quiff. And then I'm just going to carefully just pull that wool from his head over with my needles, and I'm just going to felt it down, but I'm going to leave that front end a bit loose for the moment, and we'll develop that as we add the wool in. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating between the eyebrows, I'm allowing a bit more of the wool to come forward than the rest of it, so he's got a bit of a receding hairline, almost like when your dad starts to lose his hair, or if your dad has lost his hair, or, you know, an older man who's kind of, you know, starting to recede. It's that kind of look, because that's kind of how a hedgehog's spines go. They kind of sort of are more prominent in the centre of the head, and then they recede backwards. I think it just adds a bit more character to the face as well, and to the overall project. So I'm just felting it down. I'm not going down too tightly with this. I'm quite happy to let this be quite loose. And I'm just kind of using my fine needles, tacking in the loose ends, but really building up some height to give the impression of hedgehog spines. I know some people, when they're making hedgehogs, they use like a mohair, and it comes in kind of almost like a square, a bit like a piece of carpet that you might get as a sample, and they basically trim that piece and then they sew it into place onto their hedgehog. And the mohair gives that real impression of spines, which is quite a nice way of doing it. But I think just for the purposes of our tutorial, we're going to be using the wool because it gets us practicing felting wool into other like our sculptures, and it gives us a chance to look at the different types of wool we can use, different colours, and how we can shape wool to look like all sorts of different things. So I've just sped everything up for you because once you've seen me add one piece, it's pretty much the same for the rest of the hedgehog. But we're just covering his back, covering the back with the brown wool bats, and then we're going to bring it sort of forward a little bit under his legs, but we'll do that in a moment. So just taking your time, tearing off a piece at a time and then felting it down. But don't use your medium needles, use your fine needles for this because we don't want anything too heavy. So I'm kind of pulling off pieces that are about 5 inches by 2.5 inches in width. And then holding it against him, minding out for your fingers and just felting that into place. I like doing the loose fibres and felting them in with my pen rather than kind of felting them down beforehand, which we'll do later on with some other pieces, purely because we want this not to be really compacted. We want it to be quite lofty still, and have some air in it to give that impression of spines that a hedgehog would have. The fine needles are just the right thickness to kind of get everything nicely tacked in without being too brutal with the wool. But I just find it absolutely incredible that with needle felting, oh, he's run away. With needle felting, you can take just a simple piece of wool and you can transform it into pretty much anything you want to. I think that's amazing that you're going from something that's a natural fibre, and essentially just, it's there, isn't it, really? And you can make these incredible sculptures, and that's why I absolutely love the art of needle felting. I just think it's just so incredibly satisfying knowing that something that was not overly exciting to begin with, it suddenly turned into a piece of art that can give people pleasure. So just keep turning him, making sure that he's nice and even, and keep checking him as well. Remember, I mentioned earlier on that we could take photographs because our naked eye doesn't always see things as clearly as when you look at something with a photograph. So if you can take a quick photo and you can check to make sure he's nice and even and everything's looking good. So I'm just going to pull some more wool off here and I'm going to place it on top of his head just to build up the spines on his head a bit more and create more of a definition between the head of our hedgehog and his spines. So I'm just building up that top part of his head here and creating a bit more height and a bit more definition. He looks a bit like a teddy boy from the 1950s with his spines at the moment. And this is great. So this sculpture, once you've finished him, because of his shape, what you could do is you could make this into a Christmas decoration, and all we need to do is felt some string in and felt in like a Christmas hat or something like that, and you've got a really cool tree decoration. Or you could just add some string and use him as like a door hanger for a nursery, or you could even incorporate him into a mobile. So he's nice and light, so he's not heavy when you hang him on something. It's not going to kind of, say for instance, if you were hanging him on a Christmas tree, it's not going to pull the branches down significantly. He's just going to be quite a nice light ornament to hang. So you'll find also it's quite surprising how much wool you actually get through when you're needle felting things. You'll look at a bag of wool, sort of a 250 gram bag of wool, and think, oh my goodness, this is going to last me forever. This is loads of wool. But then the minute you start incorporating it into a project like this, you'll soon discover that actually It's not loads. It doesn't really last that long, depending on the size of the project you're making. So with the mice that I make, a 500-gram bag of white wool will probably make me about 3 mice, I would say. And that's just using the white wool as the sort of the top coat, as opposed to all the core wool that goes into it initially. So he's definitely starting to resemble more of a hedgehog now and less of a potato, which is always good. And I'm just getting all this nicely felted into place. And just kind of felting the fox sheep as well, just to get again, some definition between the spines and the sort of the face of the hedgehog. And what I'm doing here is I'm just checking that he sits properly. He sits the way I want him to. So I'm just adding more wool to the back end just to kind of build up the back of the hedgehog. But he looks good. I'm happy with that. So let's move on to the last part, which is adding his ears, legs, and his arms. I shall see you very soon.